Great.
All right, give me like 4 seconds. I'm just gonna, I'll be back in 2 seconds.
Cool.
Okay. Like I knew where a shirt was.
Wearing a collared shirt.
Yeah, I had no idea. Yeah.
All right, are we ready to rock and roll?
Ready to just do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have 24 waiting, and they are playing
Nice.
now.
Oh, 5 people. Should I be showing myself? You shouldn't be showing me. Wow. Hi, everybody. I'm doing a little voyeur scanning through to see who's here. Super excited to have so many people for our presentation tonight. I see, oh my gosh, there's Carol and Erin showing her Ocean First tumbler that I'm sure is filled with Cabernet Sauvignon. We gave her a pass on the Malbec because she didn't have any, and it's okay. And there's Rhonda representing, I love it. Rachel, Krista, oh my gosh, so exciting to see everybody here. I love it. This is just wonderful. It's almost like the real thing. And Caitlin and I were chatting earlier that we knew that this was going to be a traditional Ocean First social because at about 6:10, we had several people in the waiting room. So it was just like a normal social where everybody is showing up early, hoping that the wine and the food was maybe put out early. But see, this is even better because you guys can like serve it up yourselves in the comfort of your own home. So anyways, super excited for our presentation tonight. Ari is one of our favorite guest presenters and just near and dear to the Ocean First family. Just a couple of things before we get started. First, I want to let everybody know, if you don't know already, that our pool is finally open after 2.5 months of being shut down. It is super exciting for us to have the pool finally open and to be able to invite our snorkelers, swimmers, and divers back into the shop. It's been a long dry spell, pun intended. I just thought of that. That was a pretty good one. But we're really excited to have everybody back. Yes, we have some restrictions that we have to operate under, but we're doing our very best. I see you, Colleen, with your Ocean First tumbler. I love it. Thank you so much. Keep it cool out there in the hot sun. Also, just a couple of things. I want to give a shout out to our staff at Ocean First for their incredible creativity during this really tough time. When we had to close our doors, obviously, you know, we had no form of revenue, and literally within probably a week to 10 days, our crew had come up and completely reinvented our business model and created amazing courses to offer online to keep our divers engaged. Our marine ecology courses in particular were really the saving grace during this time. We had, you know, so many amazing things going on that I just, you know, Graham and I kind of sat back and be like, this is so incredible. And we have the best team in the world working so hard day and night to make this all happen. So my great thanks to everyone who participated in that. It was really a team effort. I also want to dovetail into the marine ecology stuff that we have going on, that we have a new course that is almost ready to be unveiled, the Marine Mammal Ecology course, which I know Ari is going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. He has a great program that the California Ocean Alliance has put together for 2 sessions in July that is just looks absolutely incredible. So, you know, if you don't have anything going on or are eager to learn more, Ari's going to talk a little bit about that once he gets into his presentation. And last but not least, because who doesn't love shopping? I mean, I love shopping, and I know a lot of us do as well. We have some new Ocean First branded gear coming out very soon. Caitlin and the team, the merchandising team and marketing team at Ocean First have been working really hard and coming up with some great new hats and t-shirts and water bottles. I don't know. I mean, if any company loves promotional items, it's Ocean First. We love shopping and buying Ocean First branded material. So keep your eyes open on that. I know Caitlin's going to put a link in there in case you wanted to, while you're learning and listening to Ari's amazing presentation and drinking your Malbec, if you also wanted to shop. The beauty of these online presentations is you can do all of that at the same time. All right, so beautiful stuff. Without further ado, I want to introduce my good friend, Ari Friedlaender. I met Ari on an Antarctic adventure back in February of 2017 with several of the gals who are here this evening. I know Paula is here, Rhonda, Penny is here. I'm not sure if I have others from our group, but we had the most amazing trip. And if anybody ever has the opportunity to go to Antarctica, please make that happen. There's no place else like it in the world. And this is where the majority of Ari's research is based. We had the pleasure of meeting Ari on this trip, and just to give a little bit of background, it's like, why is the Malbec so important? Well, I mean, obviously, because it's Malbec and it's delicious, but the starting off point for Antarctic journeys is in Ushuaia in Argentina, and of course, that's where, you know, Malbec is kind of from. But when we were on our journey, we would have these events every night, I know, some kind of entertainment, and there was this one evening where we had a Antarctic trivia night, and my amazing group of 8 gals and 1 guy, very strong man to be with 8 women on a trip like that. We were dubbed the Boulder Babes because obviously we're from Boulder and we're babes. And Ari and the other crew member, I can't remember who that was, Ari, who was the host of the evening, but he introduced us as the Older Babes, which, as you can imagine, went over very well. And we corrected him immediately saying, no, 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 Older Babes, get it right. So everything worked out fine. We got a bottle of Malbec as an apology, and it worked out really fine because I'm sure that was not the first bottle of the day. And that is a little background on how we came across Ari. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Ari and let him take over the reins here because he's got an amazing presentation. The work that he does with his team in Antarctica on these beautiful creatures is absolutely fantastic. So I give you Ari. It's all yours, my friend.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kaylin. Graham, it's great to see you there. Rhonda, everybody else who was on that trip. Thank you guys for letting me come back and do this from my dining room this time. I had a lot better time coming out and visiting you guys in Boulder, and hope we can do that all again together very soon. What I wanted to do tonight was kind of give you guys a little bit of information and show you some videos and tell you about the research that we do in the Antarctic. Mostly I'm going to talk about minke whales tonight because these are the coolest little animals in the world, things that we very rarely see, but we're just starting to learn about these animals. And it's a great time to be learning about them because that environment down there in the Antarctic where we went with Amy is changing very rapidly. And so there is a strong need for us to learn about these animals so that we can understand the impacts of human activity like climate change in that region. And so what I'm going to share with you guys tonight is some videos, some images, some information about minke whales, and hopefully get you guys up to speed with sort of the current state of what we know about these animals and how we're studying them and protecting them. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go through a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully, if anybody has any questions, Caitlin, I don't know what the best way to do it is, but if somehow I can get notified or someone just wants to speak up during the talk, please do, and I can answer questions along the way. Unfortunately, well, I might be able to get a glass of wine while one of my videos is playing. So we'll see, because I'm definitely thirsty.
You can have.
So hold on. Yeah, if I could get through there, I would. Yeah. So let me try and share the screen right now and see if this will work. Okay, so Amy, can you see sort of just the single screen? Okay, awesome, great. And everybody can hear me okay, hopefully. So again, what I'm going to talk to you guys tonight are about minke whales and shedding light on these really mysterious little animals. And as you can see in this image, this is a really great image that we took using a drone flying over a group of minke whales. There's 5 different whales that you can see in the frame right here. And you'll see these little colorful tags on the back of them. I'm going to talk about these tags in quite a bit of detail because this is the way that we latch ourselves onto these animals and kind of go for a ride beneath the surface and learn about their biology. But just right off the bat, you can see that these are beautiful little animals. And the work that I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about is hot off the presses that we've been doing for the last couple of years. As Amy mentioned, I'm a research scientist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I'm also the director of research for the California Ocean Alliance, which is a nonprofit that we started and that we've partnered with Graham and the folks at Ocean First to help develop curriculum for marine mammals online course that you guys are going to have pretty soon, and doing research locally as well as in the Antarctic. So there's oftentimes what I'm going to be talking about is data that's been collected over a series of different trips with a lot of different colleagues from around the world. And it's really important for you guys to know that research on these animals takes a village. And so a lot of this work is supported by the National Science Foundation, the World Wildlife Fund, the International Whaling Commission. And then my colleagues, my kind of partners in crime come from Stanford University's Hopkins Marine Station, Duke University, folks at UC Santa Cruz, the Australian Antarctic Division. And I'm always grateful to those folks who come in the field, but also for the folks that we leave behind at home and who that kind of wait graciously for us to come back home. So a little bit of sort of personal background. As a scientist, my sort of philosophy about how I do science and what's interesting to me comes from the fields that I've studied in. And I first got trained in anatomy and physiology. I first learned about how animals were put together. And for a group like this, where diving is what brings you guys together, you guys learn a ton about human physiology and diving physiology. And so just like you guys learned about breath holding and all of the different mixtures of gas that you use in your dive tables, I was really interested as well about how marine mammals are adapted and how their physiology allows them to do things underwater that we just simply can't do, and then learning about their anatomy and what those structures are like that allow them to do that. And that has led me to then try and study the behavior of individual animals and say, let's put a tag on an animal and see how long it can hold its breath and how deep it can dive and how it can do all of these different things. And then putting that in context of the environment of how, as an animal is in a certain type of water, does it interact with its environment? For minke whales, it's something like sea ice. In California, maybe it's kelp forests. But how does the behavior of the animal get affected by the environment that it's in? And those are sort of the ways where I try and think about how I'm interested in learning. And whales are for me a particularly good example of that. And in order to do this, we need technology. So I'm going to talk a lot about these tags that we use because these animals spend about 95% of their lives below the surface where we can't see them. So we need ways to sort of track them and follow them underwater and allow us to sort of understand what they're doing there. All of this information is really valuable just for the science and for the heuristic value of learning about how animals live. But to me, there's 2 other things that come from this work that are equally as important. And the first is conservation, and it's using this information to better understand what these animals need and then how we can affect change in their environment so that these animals they thrive, so that they're there for us to go back and see in the Antarctic and for our children to go see, and so on and so forth. But at the root of all of this is education. And so for me, one of the reasons that I started the nonprofit that we did, and one of the reasons that I partner with folks at Ocean First and with Graham, is because education is really the key to making people aware of issues, getting people informed, and then getting people to care about these issues and actually promote conservation. So we try and do science and we try and make this kind of like a feedback loop of what do we need to teach people and students, And then that lets us know what things do we need to learn. And then we think about, well, what do we need to do to learn those kinds of things? So a lot of the technology and the things that I'm going to show you were born out of the need for coming up with better ways to educate people, and for us to be better educators, to be able to tell the story about these animals in a way that can be digested by people who are scientists as well as non-scientists. So the education component for me is really important. And whales are a great model for all of this. So 100 years ago, things were very different in the world, especially in the Antarctic. And this guy, Cherry Apsley Gerard, wrote a book called The Worst Journey in the World. And it's one of my favorite books in the world. But in it, he says this great quote at the beginning that polar exploration is at once the cleanest and most isolated way of having a bad time, which has been devised. And I took this to heart, and I've read a lot of the things about early Antarctic exploration, and it was a pretty horrible kind of situation. Fortunately, over time, things have become a lot more stable. There's a lot more technology, and we're a lot more comfortable and safe going to the Antarctic. So I'll sort of end with why I think what we do now is more of the best journey in the world, rather than the worst journey in the world. So there are a lot of ways, and I just sort of mentioned this, that we study animals in their environment. And what you have here is just a list of a number of the different tools that we as scientists use to study and monitor whales. Some of this can be using satellites, putting on tags that transmit information to satellites that are orbiting the Earth. I'm going to talk a lot about drones and how we use this technology. This is a drone image that you see right here, how we use that to study the anatomy of these whales and their behavior and whether they're healthy or not. Sometimes we conduct aerial surveys to go count the number of animals in a large area. We use acoustics in the ocean environment. As you guys are well aware, sound travels very differently underwater. And so we can use acoustics to learn about the marine environment. Tags I'm going to talk about very specifically, and how we put instruments on animals that measure what they do underwater. I'm not going to talk about biopsy sampling, but this is another tool that we have to collect a little skin and blubber sample that can tell us about the genetic identity of each animal, whether or not, if it's a female, if it's pregnant, what the contaminant loads are, what the diet of the whales are. There's a lot we can learn from these biopsy samples. We can do surveys from ships. And then we use citizen science as well. We use folks like you who go into the field and who dedicate your time and energy to looking at these animals and looking for these animals. And there's information that can be collected by citizens as part of the travel that you guys are doing that can then come back and tell us about where animals are at different times of the year in different locations, what types of animals are around. And so it takes this sort of full suite of information to be able to understand these animals in a way that lets us conserve them and educate other people about them in a productive way. So who are minke whales, and why are we talking about them tonight? So this is an old National Geographic poster of whales of the world. And you can see things like, here's the big blue whale, the biggest animal that's ever lived. They get up to be about 100 feet long. This is a right whale, about half the size. A fin whale that gets up to about 70 feet long. And then as you get into the smaller animals, the really tiny animals on here are dolphins. But the smallest of the whales that we have on here is a minke whale. The smallest of the baleen whales. These are the animals that have little baleen plates hanging down in the roofs of their mouth that look like a little comb that filter out small plankton or fish from the water column. So they're huge in comparison to land animals, but minke whales are the smallest baleen whale. They only get up to about 25 or 30 feet long. They're very numerous in the Antarctic. There's probably 200,000 or 300,000 of them in the entire Southern Ocean, which is the ocean that surrounds the Antarctic. One aspect of their life that makes them very difficult to study, but that makes them unique, is that they live in sea ice. They've adapted to live in the cracks and crevices of the sea ice and to make a living in there. And that's one of the reasons that they're in peril. They also make some really strange sounds like a duck. In fact, the one or two calls that they make is called a bioduck. You could go up online and listen to minke whale calls, and they sound not like what you'd think a whale does. And we know very little about their behavior because they live in such a remote place and they're very difficult to get to. Currently, or in the last several years, a lot of minke whales have been killed for what's been called scientific research. And I'm going to get to this sort of at the end in the conservation section about why the information we're collecting is relevant. And they're also going to be severely affected by climate change because of that habitat preference that they have for sea ice. So one of the things that I like to let people know is where baleen whales fit in evolutionarily into the oceans. And a lot of people are familiar with manta rays and sharks and baleen whales. But one of the things that's really cool about the ocean is that if you look over evolutionary timescales, over the last 100 million years, there's been an independent evolution for really big animals in the ocean. And one of the things that they all have in common is that they feed in the same way. So manta rays, whale sharks, basking sharks, a megamouth, and a baleen whale are all what we call filter feeders. They feed on a lot of very small things, and they're able to get very, very, very big because there's so much food in the ocean that is very small. And if you can evolve a strategy where you collect a lot of that in a short period of time, you're able to gain energy, which allows you to grow bigger and grow bigger and bigger. And so baleen whales, while they are big, they're not the only animals in the ocean that have done this. And for the last 100 million years, a lot of different animals have figured out this strategy. And it's one of the reasons that they've been successful. One of the things that this has allowed us to do is to think about how you get big and why you get big. And whereas a basking shark or a whale shark opens its mouth and kind of rams through the water and just filters out things that pass through, baleen whales have a very distendable throat pouch. You can see it. This is a blue whale that's on a flensing deck in South Georgia. And this is the tip of the chin here, and the mouth extends all the way back here, about half the length of the animal. And this fills up with water when a whale opens its mouth, and that allows it to take in a huge amount of water, which means that you can get a huge amount of prey. And we did some modeling work. My friend Jeremy Goldbogen at Stanford did this, and he found for an 18-meter whale, which is about a 60-foot whale, every time it opens its mouth and fills it with water, it can take in an amount of water that is equivalent to its own body weight. So if a whale weighed 40 tons, it could take in 40 tons of water that had some amount of prey in it. And this scales with body size. So by the time you're as big as a blue whale, you can take in 133% of your body weight in every mouthful of water. And that's a great way to be very efficient and collect a lot of food. Minke whales, the smaller whales, they don't get nearly as much in their mouth at one time, but even 75% of your body weight in water in one mouthful is still pretty amazing. So it's one of the strategies that baleen whales have evolved to take advantage of ocean life. So I wanted to show you guys some images of minke whales and what makes them sort of unique and how their different patterns exist and how you can describe them in the field. And so this is a drone image from above again. And these are all 4 different minke whales, the same species, but you see some very subtle differences. So this animal right here has this very prominent chevron on the back. That's a pigmentation color right here. This one has it, but it's a little different coloration and it's not quite as bold. And here's one down here that's got even less of it. One of the other really cool features that we see is right here. So the blowholes of the whale are right here, and there are these 2 pigment streaks that go off behind the minke whale. And these are unique to each individual. So if you were to take a bunch of pictures from on top of these animals, you could actually identify individuals just based on the shape and patterns of those sort of pigment swirls behind the blowhole. This is a nice little video showing you what it looks like when a minke whale surfaces. This is sort of a more typical view that you'd get. So you can see that nice chevron on its back there. They surface with their chin first. They have 2 blowholes right there. And then they've got this really nice kind of falcate dorsal fin, just like a dolphin has. That's one of the things that we use to identify them. So this is just a still frame looking at that minke whale coming to the surface. You can see those pigments right behind the blowholes really nicely right there. You can see the chevron right here on its back. You can also see the pectoral fin right here, and you can see it's got a bit of white coloration on it. And that's a very easy thing for us to note when they come to the surface to identify that species. Now, one of the neat things that we see in the Antarctic are what we call diatoms. These are small little organisms that grow in the summertime in the Antarctic, and they're associated with primary productivity. When you get a lot of sunlight and a lot of nutrients, you get a lot of these things in the water column, and they actually stick to the whale's skin. So this here is a minke whale that has a lot of diatoms covering it, and it's kind of discolored here. This is a minke whale that doesn't have a lot of those. And one of the things that we can say about these 2 animals is that This animal here has probably been in the Antarctic for a long period of time because it has this diatoms that have grown on it. Whereas this minke whale here has probably just arrived from the tropics where they breed, and it doesn't have those diatoms on it. One of the other things that we see on these animals that tells us that they leave the Antarctic are these white scars that you see on the side. These are made by what are called cookie cutter sharks. And these are small 2 or 3 foot sharks that live in warmer water, and they've got sort of a round hollowed out mouth, and they attach on like a lamprey or an eel would, and they actually take a little core out of these whales. So you can see here on this animal, it's got a few that are healed, and these are a couple of more recent scars on here. But those animals don't exist in the Antarctic, so these scars tell us that these animals move to different parts of the ocean throughout the year. The other thing you can see on these are 2 very different dorsal fins. This one's got a little notch in the back of it, and it's a bit more round at the point. This one doesn't have a notch in the trailing edge, and it comes to a little bit more of a point. So we'd be able to identify these as 2 different individuals. A thing that's really cool about minke whales that I bet most folks didn't know is they've got hair on their chin. Just like I've got a goatee, my dad's got a beard, Graham's got a beard. Minke whales have their own little goatee as well. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's at least 7 little pairs of hairs that are on the very front chin of the animal. We have no idea what they do, what purpose they serve. It may be a way for that animal to somehow navigate its environment. Some people think it might tell the animal when their chin is out of the water so that they know when they should start to breathe. Some people think that it's a way for them to detect movement in the water. Some people think that they may use them to figure out where prey is. If they can feel prey hitting their chin, those hairs are very sensitive. But it's a part of these animals that we've seen very frequently, but we have really no idea what purpose they serve. So this is the habitat that we work in and that minke whales live in. This is just a little video I'll show you from above. This is in one of the bays in the Antarctic Peninsula where we went with Amy and Rhonda and folks from Ocean First. And you can see this is sort of a very typical environment. You've got a couple, like a small iceberg on the left there. You've got some smaller little icebergy bits over here. There's a seal on one of these. And then this is brash ice. As the ice starts to melt and glaciers break up, you get this kind of rubble at the surface. And this is a beautiful day in one of these very secluded bays that we get to work in. The weather is oftentimes very good in them. These mountains that surround it keep the winds from being very high. But it's an environment that's very dynamic. As soon as the winds pick up, that ice can move around, the icebergs can move around. But it's not an ocean like we're used to thinking about that's just a flat surface of water. There's a lot of structure here, and this is sort of the prime habitat for minke whales. So the Antarctic Peninsula is the place where I just showed you that image from, is right here. This is the Antarctic Peninsula right here, as you can see. And it's an area that's warming very rapidly. Years, the air temperature there has increased by about 5 degrees Celsius or about 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very, very big change. And the days that are covered by sea ice have decreased from about 200 a year to about 120 per year. And so because of that, conditions are changing quite quickly for minke whales. And if you look at how ice accretes or ice advances, and the purple part here is sea ice, every month going from April to May to June to July, you see that sea ice is growing around the Antarctic in almost all of the places except around the Antarctic Peninsula where all the tourism is and where all of these minke whales that we're trying to study are. So while the rest of the Antarctic is quite stable with a lot of sea ice and a lot of habitat for minkes, this place right here that's being very affected by climate change is really changing in a way that may not be good for minke whales. And so our goal is to try and learn as much as we can about these animals before things change too much so that it can't support minke whales in that environment. So the things that we're trying to do in the study that we just sort of finished is to use a suite of these emerging technologies, drones, tags, echo sounders to measure prey availability, how we use these to increase our knowledge about a very poorly known species. And the way that we do that, I first mentioned, is we put these little tags on their back. These are tags that have been developed first by engineers at MIT, and they use the same kind of technology that you have in your smartphone that has accelerometers and motion sensors. And we stick these on the backs of these whales with suction cups. It stays on for about 24 hours to 36 hours. and then the tags fall off. All of the data is on the tag, so we have to recover these tags in order to get all that information. The tag also has a little GPS, so the tag knows where it is, and it allows us to create a track of the whale. And then the other thing that these tags have that's really cool is a video camera. And this is a new thing that's been added onto these tags that we wanted to be able to see from the whale's perspective what the environment looks like and how does their behavior relate to things in their environment. And this is particularly important for minke whales, something that lives in sea ice. We're interested in, do minke whales feed in different ways when they're in places with sea ice and without sea ice. And we wouldn't know there was sea ice there unless we had a video camera on the tag to tell us that, or we wouldn't know if the whales were swimming with other animals or if they were by themselves and how that influences their behavior. So this has become a really critical tool for us, and it's something we use on our cruises by the National Science Foundation, but also on these on tour vessels like with One Ocean expeditions that we went down with Amy, and that we went down with Graham a couple of years ago on. So using platforms of opportunity has become a really good way for us to do science and also be able to then communicate directly with passengers that are on board. So I'll be talking about kind of 2 trips that we did in February and March of 2018 and 19. We put out about 30 tags on these animals, and we collected a whole bunch of data and a ton of images. And we're now just starting to kind of process these data and see what we're able to learn about these animals. And what's really cool is that we're able to support about 7 or 8 students in my lab and my collaborators' labs to be able to use these data and train themselves to become little biologists in the world. And then we can put all that information together to develop educational programs and conservation strategies. So I'll show you a couple of videos about how we put the tags on. The tag sits in the end of about a 20-foot carbon fiber pole. We go out in these small little inflatable zodiacs, and we have to put the tag on when the animal's at the surface. And this is a nice slow-mo putting the tag on the animal. The animals don't really respond. They just kind of continue swimming like they were. The tag, they basically just probably recognize that there's just something on them, but it doesn't hurt them in any way. They go back to their tagging, to their behavior that they were doing before we tagged them almost immediately. So here's another example of putting a tag on. This is from a camera that I'm wearing on a helmet. And so in front of me, you can see that minke whale underwater just under that tag pole. And then here's the tag up here, and you'll see kind of putting the tag on. Now, of course, I'm only going to show you the ones that worked. And when it works, it looks very easy. But for every time we get a tag on, there's several hours or several days that went into just trying to get that tag on. So I could show you hours and hours of GoPro video of me swearing and looking at water and minke whales just far enough that I can't tag them. But it's good to see when things actually do work out for us. So one of the cool things that we can do once we get these tags out and put them sort of to download and we get the data back, the first thing we do is we look and we say, where did these whales go? And so what you see here, this is the Antarctic Peninsula, that place I mentioned. This is one of the bays that we're working in, a place called Andvord Bay. So the Gerlache Strait is the open part of water right here. And then Andvord Bay is all very secluded water. And each of these little green dots is a place where we tagged a whale, which that first of all tells us that these animals like to be inside these bays. And then these tracks show you where each individual animal went. And so each one of these is about a 24-hour track. And what's really cool on here is that what we've done is we've gone through the data and we found out where the animals are feeding and where they're not feeding. And so what's pretty cool about it is you can see there's a lot of feeding that occurs very deep in these bays here and over here. And that the animals, as soon as they start to leave the bay, if they do at all, they feed a little bit less. So for us, we're learning that the most important habitat for these animals to feed in is deep inside these bays, rather than in the open water that's right next to them. So this is a really cool screenshot. Now you're on the animal's back, and this is what the tag data looks like when we get it back. So up in this corner here, you have a little model that shows you the orientation of the whale. You can see it's kind of pitched up just a little bit, so it's coming up towards the surface. Down here, the things that you can look at, this blue line is the depth of the animal, and then this is the depth scale in meters. The green here is the speed of the animal, And the purple thing that you see here is what we call the jerk signal, or it's when the animal moves very rapidly in a lot of different directions. And that is an indication of a feeding event for us. And so I'll show you in this video, you'll see this little cursor will move and you'll see where feeding events occur. And this is exactly what we do, is we go through all of these videos and we audit them and pick out where all the feeding events occur. So I'm just going to fast forward this guy. Oh, sorry. So this is a cool one. This is a whale kind of in the sea ice. So you're seeing the whale, it's almost inverted or vertically oriented. It's coming up to the surface. And it's sitting in this sort of chunk of ice. Obviously the camera is getting bonked around here. Imagine if you were on a boat trying to find a whale that was sitting in sea ice like this. It's sitting super low in the water. There's another whale right in front of it that you can see. It was just right over here. But this is what minke whales do. And we only know this now because of these tags that we've put on them. They like to sit in the sea ice here and basically just hunker down and hide in the sea ice. It makes them really difficult to find and really hard for us to know how many there are in a certain area because we can't get into the sea ice with our boats. So this is about a 3-minute video, and it's sort of a collection of a bunch of different things that we do with the data. And what I'm going to let it do is sort of run, and I'll talk through it. This first thing that you see, this little racetrack that you see, or this ribbon, is us taking the tag data and putting the movement patterns of the whale in 3-dimensional space. So that ribbon represents the orientation of the whale as it's swimming. Over here, you can see the depth of the whale. The little red triangles that you see are where the animal is actually kicking. So this is an animal that's just kind of hovering around the surface and rolling on its side and doing some kind of neat things. And it's going to get into a little pattern here where it's going to do probably some feeding events where it's sort of going in a very tight circle and probably feeding at prey that's just below the surface. But what's functional about this is it tells us not only how the animal dives vertically, but how it uses space in the ocean in 3 dimensions. And this is really important when we want to understand how their movements relate to their prey. Are they able to find prey patches in one part of the water column versus another? When they do find their prey patches, how do they maneuver relative to them? And how do the movements of these whales just look sort of in general? So this is a whale now that's going to go down on a dive. It's up near the surface and it's kind of fluking. So now you see that it's going deeper. And it's doing these little red and blue triangles. That's where the animal's accelerating. Every time it kind of does these little roller coaster moves, that's probably a feeding event. So you can see again sort of how the animal uses 3-dimensional space, which is really important for us. So now just a few kind of highlights. This is on the whale's back. And you can see right there was a feeding event. It accelerated quickly and you saw the jaw kind of open pretty quickly. All those little pieces of snow that you see falling past are actually krill, the little shrimp-like crustaceans that these guys eat. It's just a nice view of a minke whale surfacing in the ice. One of his buddies is right next to him who also has a tag on it. You can see those diatoms, that kind of discoloration underneath the whale. And this is great. So this tells us that these animals swim in pairs and that they do a lot of things socially. This is cool. I think there's going to be 3 or 4 whales. There's another whale. It's rolling around at the surface with a tag. So that stuff that you just saw on the roller coaster and that ribbon, that's exactly what that whale was doing, kind of rolling over on its side. This is in a group of humpback whales. They're all feeding together. There's one opening its mouth and feeding. You can see that sort of throat cavity extending very quickly. There's a buddy of his who just took a bite there. So without the video camera, we would have no idea that this animal was feeding in a group with 5 or 6 other minkes. There's an awesome shot. You get to see just how distended their throats get. They're feeding in a coordinated way. There's 4 or 5 of them. They're lunging at the same time. They're oriented the same. So this kind of group behavior is something that until we got these tag back, we had no idea that they did. It's dark just because the whales are pretty deep, and as they get into shallower water, the camera can pick up their movements a little more. There's another feeding gulp by 4 animals at the same time, which is pretty awesome. Again, you guys are seeing this before pretty much anybody else has ever seen it. Pretty cool stuff, I think.
Hey, Ari,
So-
can I ask a question really quick?
Yeah, of course.
Was that what we were just seeing with the humpbacks? Was that them using the bubbles? You know, they do the bubble rings, that we saw when we were on our trip.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So humpback whales blow bubbles in sort of these little spiraling patterns to encircle a group of food, and then you have a bunch of them come up through the middle of that circle and feed together at the same time. Humpback whales have these really long pectoral fins, which makes them really maneuverable, and they can make these very tight circles. And it's a feeding strategy that they've evolved and that they do all over the world. We've never seen minke whales blow bubbles or use bubbles in any of their feeding strategies, but just the fact that we see them feeding together in a group is something that we thought that they were very solitary animals rather than animals that fed in groups. I'd be very surprised if they did make bubble nets, just because they tend not to make these really tight circles, and they don't have the big pectoral fins to be able to do that. But it's a strategy that works for humpbacks, and it certainly could work for minkies if they figured it out. So just a couple of the findings. I wouldn't be a good scientist if I didn't make a couple of graphs and pie charts. One of the things that we were interested in was seeing when minke whales feed. And what we found from those 30 or 35 tags that we put on was that the majority of the whales feeding is at night. About 2/3 of the time that these animals spend feeding is during nighttime. What's interesting is that in the Antarctic in January and February, the number of nighttime hours that you have is very small. So in January, you might only have 2 or 3 hours of night. February, you might only have 5 or 6. So that's why if you look at the effort or the amount of food that the whales get, in nighttime, they spend a lot of time feeding, but they're getting about half of their food. So the bang for the buck in terms of the amount of time they're spending versus the amount of food they're getting is relatively low, whereas during the day, they spend less time feeding, but they're able to collect more food during that time. And as you can see, there's also another big difference between these two periods. During the day, the whales feed at about 60 meters, about 180 feet, versus at nighttime, the whales are feeding at about 30 feet of depth. So that, in my mind, says these animals are changing their behavior between day and night, and what is it about the environment that is making these animals do that? So what we did is we sort of made a heat map here, and what this shows you is that from dawn, during the day, and then at dusk, and then into night. So along this axis, you have a 24-hour period, and then this is the surface water, relatively shallow and going deeper. And then the colors that you see here represent how much the animals were feeding. So this is lunges per hour. This is how many times that whale opened up its mouth in an hour. And so you see a couple of really cool patterns. The most activity that you see, and that I showed you in that graph, was that the whales are feeding during the nighttime, and it's up very close to the surface, and their feeding rates, the number of times they feed per hour, is very high. If you look here, though, you can kind of see a different color, and there's a bit of feeding effort down here in deep water during the daytime, which I showed you, about 60 meters depth. They're feeding there, and they're feeding less frequently. They're not feeding as many times an hour as they are during nighttime. The reason that they're doing these things differently is because the prey are changing their behavior. So if you compare during the daytime, this is what we call an echogram. This is taking a fish finder, an echo sounder, and putting a very high frequency sound in the water, and then it bounces back. And the amount of sound that bounces back, or the echo, tells us about if there's things in the water column that have a different density than water. So the colors that you see here, these are all krill patches. Each of these is a discrete krill patch. And during the day, you can see that these krill patches are not necessarily right up at the surface, but they're a little bit deeper. If we look at night, those patches are a little closer to the surface here. And so what we're seeing is that the whales during the day are going down and feeding on this food. And then during the nighttime, they're waiting for that prey to come up, and they're feeding on the prey that's very shallow. So the difference here is that the whales are spending more of their time feeding at night in higher lunge rates, but those patches are smaller. And so they're having to do a little bit more work to find that food during the nighttime, whereas during the day, you have these patches down here and they're probably getting a bit more food because they're bigger krill patches during the day and it's easier for them to find. So as conditions change in this part of the world, how that's going to impact where krill are and how their patches are structured is going to have a big impact on how these minke whales feed and how they survive. So one of the other cool things that we've been able to find just by taking pictures of these animals is whether or not there's just one species of minke whale in the Antarctic. So at the beginning, I showed you those Antarctic minke whales. You see this really nice kind of patch on the back. It's got these white patches on the flank. It's got this really nice long rostrum, and it's got these streaks behind the blowhole. Well, when we were in the Antarctic at the end of the season last year, we photographed a group of minke whales that looked a little bit different. And this is an image of one of those whales from the Antarctic. And you can tell just by looking, it has a very different patch on its back. It doesn't have the same patterning on its sides. The head is much smaller. It doesn't have those streaks behind the blowholes. And the pectoral flippers here are bright white. This is actually a dwarf minke whale. This is a species of minke whale. It's very closely related to the Antarctic, but these guys live in warm water in the tropics, Great Barrier Reef, off the coast of Central America, Tahiti and Moorea, there's animals like this. And what this raises to us is, what is this animal doing in the Antarctic? It could be that it's just a random event and that this animal decided to swim to the Antarctic, but we found 4 or 5 of these guys, and more people are starting to see these animals in the Antarctic. And it may be a bit of a warning sign that animals from warmer environments are moving into these polar latitudes because conditions are changing, because things are warming, and it's actually able to support more tropical species like this. So we need to keep a very vigilant eye on this and better understand whether or not these animals are increasing in abundance in the Antarctic, or if they just happen to show up every once in a while. So to summarize kind of the findings from the science that we've done and that we're doing so far, these guys have incredibly high feeding rates. 90 times, eating 90 times in an hour for a whale is pretty amazing. If a blue whale were to feed, we get them feeding about 20 to 25 times in an hour because it takes them a lot longer to take a mouthful of water. But minke whales are feeding in very, very rapid rates. They have this diel foraging pattern, meaning that they change from day to night. And what the whales are doing is they're changing where they feed relative to where the prey are in their environment. We found that group feeding is common from the video tags, and that's something that we had no idea about beforehand. That the whales largely remain in these coastal bays and they associate with sea ice when it's present, but if there's no sea ice available, they tend to stay very deep in these bays. And there's greater potential for competition as conditions change. So as other whales, like other minke whales, come in and start using this environment, it could mean that more animals are going to be competing for the same resources, and it's something that we need to be very vigilant of. I mentioned sort of at the beginning too, that minke whales have been the subject of not a commercial harvest so much as a scientific harvest. And for the 1990s and early into the 2000s, the Japanese government used a special permit and said that we have some scientific questions that we want to ask about how minke whales feed. How much do they feed? How much do they eat? How quickly do they reproduce? And they said that in order to be able to answer those questions, they needed to kill a bunch of animals to be able to look in their stomachs at their contents, look at their reproductive tracts. And that was the only thing available to them to be able to understand about the life history of these animals. In 2014, the governments of New Zealand and Australia took the government of Japan to court. And the International Court of Justice was the governing body that heard the case. And effectively what they were arguing is that scientific whaling is a bit of a farce, that you don't need to do these kinds of things to learn about these animals. And the court ruled in favor of the Australian and New Zealand governments, saying that the way that the Japanese had set up their scientific whaling program truly wasn't scientific. They weren't justifying the numbers of animals that they were killing, and that there are new technologies, like the tags that we've been putting out on these animals, that are non-lethal ways of doing research that allow you to learn just as much about the animals without having to kill them. And so because of that, and because of sort of the downstream impacts from that decision, the Japanese have stopped whaling in the Antarctic and have actually removed themselves from the International Whaling Commission, which is the governing body that manages and conserves whales, especially in the Southern Ocean. So this was a real victory for science and for conservation. And it was really doubly good for us because we were able to show and demonstrate that by putting these tags out and building new technology, we can study these animals in a non-lethal way and learn just as much about them as you would otherwise. So we're very excited and we're very proud of that. The other thing that this is really important for us is for developing marine protected areas. Last year when we went and did our dive trip with you guys, we went to the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. That's effectively a marine protected area where the ecosystem is very fragile and it's very important. And there are limits and legislature about what you can and can't do in those areas. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of these places that we really need to protect right now, even more so than it already is. Because climate change is occurring very quickly, there's a commercial krill harvest in this area, which is potentially competing with the animals like baleen whales that need that food resource to be able to reproduce. And so the more we can learn about the whales, the more we can simply say where these animals go and what their needs are, will allow us to go to the table with the governing bodies that manage the Antarctic and say, these are important areas for these animals. We need to protect these. We need to keep fishing out of these. We need to limit the amount of activity that goes on here because these are very sensitive areas. So gaining all this information is really useful for making the case and making the argument as to what it is that these animals need and what is it that we don't know about these animals that we still need to in order to effectively manage them and keep human activities from having as small an impact as possible on them. So this is just a fun little video to end. Obviously 100 years ago, working in the Antarctic was more about survival. We've got a lot of tools and a lot of capacity now that makes working in the Antarctic the best journey in the world. And one of the best things is when you get opportunities to interact with animals like this. This is a curious little minke whale that just came up and decided to take a look at us. This is Dave Cade, one of my graduate students. This is Dave Johnston and Julian Dale from Duke, who are two of our favorite colleagues. And minke whale just gave Dave a little shot there. But having the opportunity to work in the Antarctic is amazing. Just to go and visit it, like Amy said, is really spectacular. And then when you get to have opportunities like this, where animals that are curious by nature, that have never seen people before, show these kinds of signals that they're just as curious as we are. And to be able to do this and to work in this environment is really, really satisfying, really gratifying. And I'm excited that we're able to do the research, but more so to be able to share it with folks like you and to develop educational programs and conservation strategies to help mitigate what these animals are doing. So I appreciate you guys sort of having a listen and hopefully you learned a little bit from this. The last thing I wanted to mention, as Amy said, is that we and Ocean First have both committed a lot of time and energy to developing educational programs. And we typically in the California Ocean Alliance have a summer program where we bring high school students to Santa Cruz and take them into the field and teach them and train them how to do science and how to get excited about STEM education. Unfortunately, this year we can't take students into the field, but we've developed an online course that we're really excited about that'll be about a week long that will set the stage for these longer courses like the Marine Mammals course that Ocean First is going to be able to offer later on. And we really encourage you guys to check out our website. It's a week-long course that'll have a lot of modules. There'll be a lot of interactive work with leaders from around the world, from the Smithsonian, from Washington, D.C., from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from Central America. It's a great opportunity for students or just interested individuals to take a week, 3 hours a day to learn about marine mammals, what makes them exciting, what are the careers like in marine mammal science, and sort of what are some of the experiences of folks that have made it in the field. So I'd encourage you guys to go check out the website. There's a link right on there for the marine, what is it called? The MOE, the Marine Online Experience, I think is what we're calling it this year. I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and I hope we get to see some of your faces in July through the course. I'll stop sharing my screen right now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have, and look forward to hearing from you.
Awesome. I'll start the story. Well, it's more of a storytelling than a question, but I just that last image that you had, Ari, of the Minke whale coming up to the boat was just reminded me of an experience that myself and the gals had when we were on our trip, where we had this juvenile humpback who came up to our boat, and what was so amazing to me was the body awareness that these creatures have. They're enormous, and here we are on this boat, and this animal came up with so much curiosity, right literally within inches of our boat, that could easily have flipped us over, but was so precise in its movements, and just kind of rolled over and kind of gave us an eyeball. You know, I don't know, there's probably a technical term for eyeballing, but
That's it. Yep.
yeah, there we go. Okay. But you know, his fluke was up, and not once did it touch our boat, but was so close that it could have easily it was just incredible. It was such a special moment that they just had this awareness.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind, I mean, we get those kind of goosebumps every time this happens to us too. And I think it's one of the things that keeps us going and gets us excited. And I think you can't appreciate that kind of experience without having it. It really is moving. And to know that these animals are so aware and so graceful, and at any time could do something that would be kind of bad for people, to know that they're there just being curious, to me is really, really amazing. Yeah.
It was so cool. And I had just one other question. Sorry, I'm like going to fire away, but what are, if you can remind me, the predators of the Minke whales? That was, I think, an interesting little tidbit there.
Yeah, so it's a really good point. I didn't kind of go into it, but killer whales in the Antarctic, there are several different what we call ecotypes. They're all killer whales. They're all the same species, but they have subtle differences in the places they go and the food that they eat, and they have slightly different color patterns. But the type A killer whale in the Antarctic is the Minke-eating killer whale. And we're finishing a paper right now where we put out a bunch of satellite tags on those killer whales. And if you look at the habitat for those killer whales, it's that Gerlache Strait. It's the area right next to the bays where we were working, where the Minke whales don't go. And if you look at the behavior of Minke whales in the areas where killer whales live, they basically get there and they zip across the road as fast as they can to get to the next bay. Because killer whales typically, in order to hump Minke whales, they chase them and they try and exhaust them. And they need open water to be able to do that. So Minke whales like to hide out in these bays, and then they get a little nervous, and then they just kind of zip across the bays, kind of, you know, the straits to the next bay.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, pretty cool to see.
Ari,
Hey, Ari. Oh, sorry, Caitlin.
Go ahead.
It's I'll just be quick. It's good to see you, man. You look a little different without a bunch of ice in your beard. I almost didn't recognize you at first. But I just wanted to say thank you again for coming and, well, virtually anyway, and doing another presentation. It's always great to see you. And just a really big kudos for your course. I know that you guys have been working on that, or an idea of that, for a long time. And I'm sure you're really excited to see it all come to fruition. And I'm definitely going to be one of your first students in July. So I look forward to taking that. But my quick question is, I'm not a wine connoisseur, and I would love to get what's the Malbec tip of the night?
Geez. The great thing about wine is that all you need to do is find one that you like. I was talking to my dad earlier today because I had a Malbec that he had given me probably 8 or 10 years ago that still sticks in my mind as one of the best ones I've ever had. The vineyard was called M. I'm a firm believer, though, that wine tastes better where it's made, you know? And so if you truly want to experience a Malbec, go to Buenos Aires and go to a steakhouse and get a beautiful, you know, piece of grass-fed beef there and drink a Malbec, and it'll change your life. Just the same way a Cabernet well if you come down to, to Napa Valley or anywhere that wine is produced like that. You go to Oregon and have a Pinot, it's going to taste better there. So I would encourage you to definitely go out and explore that way.
That sounds good. I might just eat some grass and have the wine vegetarian, but point taken. Thanks, Ari.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. It's great to see you, man.
Excellent question, Graham. This next question comes from Carol. She wanted to know, when the whaling fleets see your research, the nighttime feeding and closer to the surface, won't they use it in hunting the whales?
That's a good question. The place where the whales were taken in the commercial harvest was actually from the east side of the Antarctic, almost south of Australia, not around the peninsula where we work. Those fleets, if you ever seen the show Whale Wars, as soon as they get anywhere near people that are interested in them not doing it, they've got a problem. And so for a fishery like that is very controversial, to operate in a place like the peninsula where there's a lot of tour vessels and there's a lot of eyeballs on them, would not be an ideal place. Also, because of the habitat, there's not a lot of minke whales in those areas without a lot of sea ice. So they tried and focus their work on the areas where there was a lot more sea ice, and it's a lot more remote.
Awesome. And Kathy Christopher would like to know if the baby minkies have the chin hairs. Are they more or less prominent than seen on the adults?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, the way that hairs are in marine, in at least cetaceans and whales and dolphins, is kind of the reverse to people. We don't grow hair on our chins until we get a little bit older, but neonates and baby dolphins and small whales are the ones that typically have small hairs on their rostrum. And if they don't serve a function, they'll fall out after a short period of time. What we're trying to do with the minke whales is use those images from the drones and measure the individual whales that we have really good images of, where we can see if there's hair on them and see whether or not it's just small animals that have those hair, or whether or not you see adults that have those hairs as well. And we're literally in the process of analyzing those data right now. I would guess that it is the smaller animals that typically have those hairs, but I couldn't tell you for sure.
All right. And Debbie would like to know if you have any other books besides Unframeable.
I have lots of books. Whether they're mine is a different question. I have not finished my second book. I've got all the images, and to be honest, I was thinking about doing something slightly different. And instead of doing a coffee table book like that, I was thinking about making a smaller set of printed images in portfolios and having sets of 8 or 10 images that are printed and in sort of like a custom large framed box, and doing something that way rather than doing a second full book. But I'm open to the idea. It's honestly more about what gets people more excited and interested. Is it seeing more images and being able to leaf through them, or is it having a smaller number of images that you can contemplate a little bit more? So I am happy to talk to whoever wants to about that.
Awesome. Another question is, if the whales are feeding around the clock, when do they sleep?
That's a very good question. Technically speaking, whales don't sleep. They are conscious breathers. So whereas we just unconsciously are breathing, for an animal that lives in the water, if you've got your blowhole open and you're underwater, you're going to drown. So a whale's sort of default position is to have your blowholes closed. And so they actively have to use muscles to open the blowhole to breathe. So they really can't sleep. We see humpback whales that sit at the surface and log, and they can be very lazy and they can kind of shut down a little bit, but they have to consciously breathe. So they don't do the same kind of sleeping that we do. It may be that the periods when they're not feeding and they're just cruising around, they're resting, and that they're doing a lot less. But without putting, electrodes near the head to look at brain activity, we really don't know whether or not these animals kind of switch off between being fully aware and being kind of half aware. Amy and Rhonda, I don't know if you guys had this happen in the Antarctic, but sometimes when you see a whale that's logging or resting at the surface, you can get up really close to it before it responds to you. And you almost get the sensation like they're just kind of they're zoning out, and they're not really aware until something gets in front of them and they see it. But sometimes they can be quite passive and very restful, but not asleep.
All right, and one more question from Kim. She would like to know, how long do minkies stay underwater, and how does that compare to other whales in the Antarctic?
Yeah, so there is a correlation. If you look just in terms of body size and how long you should be able to hold your breath. It doesn't necessarily hold true when you get into big whales, because remember how much energy I said it takes a blue whale to be able to feed. So a blue whale can't hold its breath for 5 times longer than a minke whale. The longest dive that we've recorded for a minke whale, I think, was only about 9 or 10 minutes. Humpback whales, it can be up to about 20 minutes. Blue whales, it might be 25 minutes or so. The champion divers are the beaked whales, the sperm whales. Beaked whales, which are about the same size as a minke whale, but they have teeth, and they feed down between 2,000 and 3,000 meters. So a beaked whale can hold its breath for up to 90 minutes and can go down to about 3,000 meters. A minke whale, the farthest we've had them dive, is about 200 meters for about 9 or 10 minutes. They're crazy. They're insane. I mean,
Ari, I remember we had come across a group or a pod of the Minkes on our trip, and it was remarkable how fast they were. They were just, the suckers were clipping along. You know, I mean, I guess, you know, if you're like trying to run from an, orca, you probably would develop some speed, but it was just pretty impressive. They were just, I mean, really sleek and quick.
They are the fastest. Well, fin whales may be a little faster kind of at the top end, but minke whales are notoriously fast. And I've been in boats going 12 or 13 knots, and I've had a minke whale come up from behind and just pass us and porpoise like a dolphin would be. It's extraordinary to see them, a big animal like that, moving that quickly. And when we watch the videos, or if you have like the drone footage, you oftentimes barely even see the flukes move, and the whales are moving really pretty quickly. And they're so hydrodynamic, and they're so slippery in the water. It's amazing. Yeah, very fast animals.
So cool.
Yeah.
We have one more question. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Rhonda.
So I just have a question, because I know that One Ocean has had some challenges. Are you guys going to be able to continue research in Antarctica with Nat Geo or something? I mean, because could be an issue. Yeah,
it's a great question. When we started doing work in the Antarctic from these platforms of opportunity, we were approached by companies that were interested in having scientists on board to try and increase the scope of what they were offering to passengers. And One Ocean was a company that approached us and had this mission and said, look, we want scientists to be part of all of our trips, and we see the value added to getting people like you guys on board that want to do more than experience the place passively, but be part of things. Unfortunately, the organization wasn't managed well, and they no longer are operating. But almost every other tour company down there, I don't know if it's out of sheer interest or it's keeping up with the Joneses, are now trying to include more and more science on their platforms. So when One Ocean kind of had their setbacks, I had 5 or 6 companies, pretty quickly after that said, hey, we're interested in having your whale science on board. Like, let's figure out a way to do this. So this past season, we went down with a company called Hurtigruten, which is a Norwegian company. They're fantastic. They do a ton of education work on their boats, a little bit bigger platforms, but they're wonderful. We're working in platforms that are 1 and 200 passengers, as well as in smaller boats. One of my students went down on the Hans Hansen, which is a 16-passenger vessel, and he went along to do science on board with him, with a guy named Ted Cheeseman. So we are sort of diversifying the platforms that we go on. For us, the issue is it's a lot of equipment for us to bring, and it's not easy to go through airports with a crossbow for biopsy sampling and a tag pole. So if we can have one company where we can keep all of our equipment on and have people go on that, multiple times, logistically, it's easiest for us. And we prefer to do that and work with one or two groups, but we are very open to working with groups. If somebody says, hey, we want to do a small trip and we want to focus on doing whale research and we want somebody from your group to come down and do it, those kinds of things are fantastic, and we're open for those kinds of things.
All right, it looks like we've got one more question from Kathy. She is asking, are the krill as abundant in the straits as they are in the bays? So are they giving up food options to avoid the orca predators?
That's a very, very good question. Krill move around quite a bit throughout the year. So in the high summer, in January, early February, the female krill move offshore and they go into very deep water to deposit their eggs. And then they slowly move back inshore. Juvenile krill tend to stay inshore for most of the year. So in the beginning of the summertime, there's a lot of krill dispersed over a big area. As it gets into March and April into fall, those adult krill move back inshore and end up sitting in the bays, and they aggregate into these massive patches, and then they sink to the bottom and they sit there for the winter time. So for about April to about June, before the sea ice cover comes in, there's a ton of krill in these bays. And the commercial fishermen are just starting to figure this out. And if you look at where the whales go at this time of year and where the krill fishermen are going, it's all to exactly the same places. And that's one of the issues that we have, is we can now show that, yes, minke whales hang out in these bays and that's where they stay. And as soon as a fisherman comes in there, you're in competition with them. So in the middle of the season or the early season, krill are spread out quite a bit. Towards the end of the season, the bays become these absolutely critical places for the whales, as well as for penguins and seals and other things that are feeding on krill.
Wow. Well, I have one final question, Ari, and maybe this is our wrap-up question. And this is on behalf of those of us here, Richard, Paola, Graham, Rhonda, and John. We would like to know, are there any whales in the Channel Islands?
Man, that's a tough question. They're not called the Whale Islands. You know, things are weird, you know, in the Channel Islands. It has become a really, really warm place. You know, there's a lot more tuna fishing that goes on there. Monterey Bay has become a pretty hot spot for whales recently. I worry about the Channel Islands. I worry that we're having more and more years that the water just doesn't cool off down there, and that we're getting a lot more very warm water species that are moving up into those areas. And so the tropics are extending north. And so the animals that may have been in the Channel Islands may be more in Monterey Bay, and the animals that typically were here might be even farther north than here. Yeah, it's challenging. We worked in the Channel Islands around Catalina last year for about 3 weeks, and plenty of dolphins. I think we saw 2 whales the whole time we were there. Yeah, but there's about 60 humpbacks right now in Monterey Bay, and lots of activity here. Yeah.
Well, it's luck of the draw, really.
Yeah. I mean, if we had distracted you guys with whales too often, I know Rhonda would have been really upset. I know her kids would have been so upset that they didn't get to go in the water 5 times a day. So I feel like, you know, it was for the best. It was, yeah, definitely, absolutely for the best.
And thankfully, we all survived that trip.
Hey, now.
That's true.
You know.
Hey, Ari, just quick question. Do minkies do heat runs like humpbacks?
That's a very good question. We know absolutely nothing about their breeding biology. We know so little, in fact, about where they give birth even. I had a researcher from Moorea who had video of a minke whale, Antarctic minke whale, and a calf from off the beach there, and she'd seen it 2 or 3 times over 3 or 4 years. That was the first footage I've ever seen of a minke whale mother and calf in the tropics. And that was enough information that she's going to be able to write a scientific paper just saying, hey, minke whales calving right here. That's something we didn't even know. I don't know that they aggregate into these big, very dense concentrations like humpbacks do on breeding grounds. They may be in the open ocean and we just haven't found them yet, but we know next to nothing about them. One of the interesting things, though, I will say about minke whales is that one of my graduate students is looking at these biopsy samples, and about 90% of the females are pregnant every year in that population. And they are known to reproduce annually. So their gestation is less than a year, but they are giving birth to, or getting pregnant at least, every single year, because there's enough food around for them that's not limiting, and there is no competition for food. And so those whales are able to reproduce as quickly as they biologically are capable of. And even humpback whales in the Antarctic now, we see about 15% of the females are both pregnant and lactating at the same time. And so they can only do that when there is an unlimited amount of resources so that they can energize themselves to have enough to fuel themselves, to grow a calf, and to also wean a calf.
I was hoping to see that slow-mo of you shooting the whale with the crossbow in your presentation, but I see it didn't make it.
I don't have a copy of that one.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Oh, I got to get that to you.
No. Yeah, that was too high resolution, I think.
That was very James Bondish.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thanks again, man. It was great seeing you.
Yeah, you too. We got to keep in touch. It's easy to do.
Well, thank you, Ari, so much. This is wonderful. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you next time.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if you guys have any other questions at any time, just shoot me an email. I love hearing from you guys. I love hearing about what you guys are doing. And you guys make us doing science really fun, because you're a fantastic audience to share it with, and you make us think about really good questions. So you guys keep doing what you're doing and stay safe. And I really hope we get to see you either in Boulder or out here on the West Coast.
Absolutely. Ari, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
All right, take care. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.